Welcome to Hashkafa with a Heretic, where we explore the works of Hashkafa that are often recommended to people with questions of emunah to lay our doubts and keep us on the Derech. I blog as the second son, and I'm your heretical host. Are there really answers to all the questions? Are kashis really terutzim? Are we stark apikorsim or stam amaratzim? Let's find out.
This week's guest is Nehemiah Kraus.
Hi, this is Nehemiah Kraus. I grew up in a frum household with a extensive yeshivish education, and I have since pursued study of religion on an academic setting in college, and possibly considering a master's in that as well. So that's where I am. Chovos HaLevavos is sort of at home for me, but there's always something new and interesting there.
In this week's episode, Nehemiah and I discuss the syncretistic nature of Judaism, and of the Chovos HaLevavos in particular. The Chovos HaLevavos' stress on the importance of starting from the beginning and logically proving the existence of God, in contrast to the current popularity of emunah peshutah, and what shema is meant to convey.
I think a lot of people who emerge from the yeshivish environment develop an interest in sort of the underpinnings of frumkeit and religion in general, and wherever they go with it, whether they remain from or they go off the derech or whatever, but a lot of people are interested in a more nuanced account of Judaism and how it works into things like world history and philosophy and things like that. And it's interesting to hear from different people after having left yeshiva, wherever they are in life now, the body of knowledge they've attained and what they come out with. And it's always interesting to talk to people like that, such as yourself, and sort of root back to what we learned in yeshiva and then compare it to what we learned after yeshiva and sort of either try to justify it or try not to justify it.
I realized a while back that everything I learned in school is wrong, pretty much. I mean, 1 + 1 is 2, but everything else, and that goes for both the Limudei Kodesh and the Limudei Chol. George Washington didn't chop down the cherry tree, and you can start a sentence with a conjunction, and the Maccabees did not defeat the Greeks. All this stuff.
Yeah, I think you're right about 1 + 1 is 2. I think STEM and, math, science, etc., that's the stuff that you're going to learn in school. And it's not going to be proven wrong after you graduate, but when it comes to anything having to do with the humanities, that's always up for debate. So when you talk about George Washington's cherry tree or things like that, you might not learn until later how to discern between history and folktales or history and myth. And that's the sort of thing that you would either have to do your own research for or pursue history on a higher level in the university or something like that, where you ask the hard questions, the critical questions that they thought you weren't good enough for when you were in 3rd or 4th grade. You weren't advanced enough for, so they sort of just gave you a simplified version account of history, and then afterwards you can pursue it on your own. And I think it's the same with religion. I think people change their hashkafa one way or the other when they leave the yeshiva environment and they pursue their own truth. Sometimes those truths are more nuanced, sometimes they're not. But one way or the other, I don't think education ends when you graduate.
Absolutely.
I did want to point one thing out, just because I found it on my own recently. The Chovos HaLevavos was written at a time when Jewish and Muslim philosophy had a great deal in common. Philosophical arguments weren't really even between Jews and Muslims per se. They were between schools of thought, each which had support from both Jews and Muslims. So it wasn't even like a partisan divide for a lot of the discussions that go on in philosophy and religious mysticism and things like that. But when it comes to Chovos HaLevavos, you have this sort of gray area where it's not entirely essential to understanding the raw material of the text, whether the author was Jewish or Muslim. You don't have to really know that. Although it's obviously true from what the Chovos HaLevavos always brings down psukim and quotes from the Gemara. But as far as the things he's actually saying, the ideas, it's not a strictly Jewish work, and I found several historians who claim that the Chovos HaLevavos was based on Sufi Muslim texts which preceded it. I haven't found any demonstration of that or any papers showing, line by line how he got this from that and this from that, but there are definitely other texts that did happen to. There was a Muslim philosopher, Ghazali, who was sort of a mystic and a philosopher. He wrote a book called Mizan al-Amal, and it was translated hundreds of years later by someone, I guess you would call him a Rishon, but not exactly. He was Ibn Hizdai ben Samuel Halevi, and he translated into Hebrew, called it Moznei Tzedek, and took out all of the Quranic citations and switched them for psukim and quotes from Chazal. And I read this a while ago, and I didn't confirm it, but I actually now have screenshots to confirm that this is true. And this is I'm not trying to make a claim that everything we got was stolen from the Muslims. What I'm saying is that there's so much that's neutral that could pass for either Jewish or Muslim. And I think that's just really fascinating to know that when you read through that translation of that work, you can't really tell whether there's no reason, it reads just like a regular Musar Sefer. There's really no distinction, and I think probably the same can be said for Chovos HaLevavos. If you were to translate it back into Arabic, there would be very little, and maybe replace the quotes from the Torah with quotes from the Quran, there would be very little to indicate that this is a Jewish text.
So it's very interesting, and brings a few things to mind. One is there is a Musar Sefer, I forget the name offhand, which is based on something that Benjamin Franklin wrote about improving yourself, and he has a whole system, and you take, like every month you work on something, and it's basically Right. So I think Judaism has always been a syncretistic religion. It borrows from the cultures that it finds itself in and just changes it a little bit to work for itself. I don't mean to suggest that we stole everything, but that this idea that you get in yeshiva, that Yiddishkeit exists in a hermetically sealed bubble, and everything is Moshe Sinai. It's not. There's a dialogue. It goes back and forth. We borrow ideas, we change them, we give them back. They're changed and they come back again. The other thing is what you were saying about how it's Islamic thought. The last podcast I did, I went through the first few chapters. He kept talking about the unity, and I had no idea what that was exactly, but it sort of tickled something in the back of my mind. And I looked it up afterwards, and I realized that his whole approach is basically Neoplatonism. He believes in the one. He translates a shema as, "Hear Israel, God is your God, God is the one." And that's what this whole thing, and he equates the one with God, and the idea that is where everything comes from. And he says explicitly that the point of this sefer is to bring people into the knowledge of the one.
Right. And you wouldn't know what he means by the one unless you had known the Neoplatonic background to that.
Right.
And maybe you would have just translated, the one, he's talking about Hashem, but you wouldn't understand where he's coming from or what motivated him to talk about the one.
Right. But more than that, but without that sort of background, I think you misunderstand his point. And it still works as Hashkafa Sefer, right? You substitute God for the one, but you're not really quite getting it. And I mean, I didn't know enough to know it offhand, but at least I knew where to look. And I think the average yeshiva guy learning this in that hermetically sealed bubble is getting something of a distorted view of what it is.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that. And Rabbeinu Bachya wasn't the first to Neoplatonism itself took Plato's idea of the good and then turned into sort of a more mystical, religious-y sort of concept. And then after that, and this is going back to the early centuries CE, after that you have just one after the other these different schemes of emanationism where you start with one supreme being and then it goes down in levels. You find it in Kabbalah, you find it in Ibn Gabriel, you certainly find it in Muslim sources, and then in Rabbeinu Bachya. So even in that, he's not even really alone in doing that. This is not his invention to decide to take that concept and convert it to Judaism. Everyone is doing this. When Rabbeinu Bachya is writing this, everyone is coming up with these different schemes of emanation to sort of ex religion and describe them in a more philosophical but also mystical way. So yeah, and as for, I can just also point out, if I can just get one point in, when you said about not understanding this when you're in yeshiva, I can just say on my own, when I was in yeshiva, I tried starting the Rambam's Shmona Prakim, his Hakdama to Pirkei Avos, probably 2 or 3 times, and I did not get past the first few pages. After I started becoming a little more familiar with what philosophy looks like, the frame of reference gave me more of an understanding, and I was able to complete the Shmona Prakim because you realize you know more what to expect. A lot of things that strike you as strange when you expect the Rambam to talk like, let's say, like Rabbeinu Yonah, and he doesn't. It doesn't strike you as strange or as alien when you have already read up on some of these other.
Yeah. So let's get started here. Chapter 3. So this is also something I discussed last time. The whole concept that we often hear that you don't have to look into this yourself because so-and-so who's so much smarter and so much greater than you, he believed it and you just rely on him. Here he's explicitly saying that that's not good enough. You have to look into it yourself.
Right. It's sort of shocking that he would say that he would say, no, you have to do your own personal sort of research when everything we hear now is the contrary. And this might have been him just sort of trying to justify what he was doing as okay, and maybe he had opponents even at the time who did not like his making everything into rational systems and trying to delve into this philosophy stuff, and to which he's saying, no, you have to do that, and it's integral to your being an Erlich Yid or whatever.
No, that makes sense, because he spends an awful lot of time justifying what he's doing. Like, the whole long introduction is all about why it's okay to do this, why it's necessary to do this. I looked here, I looked there, I didn't find, and this book needs to exist, so I'm writing it.
It sounds like he's justifying what he's doing to his opponents, making it legit. It's also interesting, again, he does make it as if he's going to prove Judaism, right? When he says, the nations to admit our claims of superior wisdom and things like that, and he goes on like that, and he says, the nation shall walk by your light. Sounds like he's going to prove, like he's going to go more the Kuzari route how we understand the Kuzari route to have been some sort of proof of Judaism over Islam and Christianity, but I don't think he's going to do that, right? He's going to start talking about God and things, and it's not going to be exclusive to Judaism either. So I'm sort of curious why he added that in, that whole thing about the nations, the Goyim and us and everything. Like, he doesn't really continue like that. So it's a little bit, I wouldn't say disappointing, but I think it's a little bit misleading.
That seems to be very often how these things go. You start by proving God, and therefore our particular version of Frumkeit is true. Chapter 4. Any matter which one would like to understand when one is in doubt of its very existence must first ask, does it exist or not? Now that's good. That's a good starting point, because a lot of these things just assume that a God exists and work from there.
Right, and also I think that sort of paints the picture of how his perception of approaching Hashem, of approaching God, is one of sort of constructing God through logic. And it's such a far cry from, let's say, the end of Yom Kippur when, they go Hashem Hu Elokim 7 times, like everybody's, gets all into it. That's a very different way the Rebbeinu Bachya is sort of embarking on to feel God, by sort of giving him more philosophical descriptions. And there's not a lot of his stylus here for the yeshiva sprach here. There's not a lot of just thinking about Hashem, Hashem, Hashem. It's more actually trying with sort of a sound mind and a level head to build God from the ground up. And this also, I would say, this doesn't really fit very well with the model of Musar Seder in a yeshiva or things like that, where you learn sefarim like these in the hispilus way of sort of trying to invoke your own emotions and trying to appeal to your own emotions, I should say, in accepting Hashem and understanding Him. And instead, Chovos HaLevavos is saying the exact opposite. You have to use your mind and your logic and start with questions like, does it exist or not? I think that's just a very stark contrast from what I assume you also, your experience was in yeshiva.
Yes, very much. He's more than that. By starting from the beginning, he's allowing himself to ask the question, does God exist? Like, you're not allowed to ask questions like that. I was explicitly told not to ask questions like that.
Does Hashem exist?
Yeah, I don't know if I ever actually asked that. I think I was too deep in it to come to that point. But, to ask, is this real? Does the world really work the way we've been taught? And he's throwing that right down to nothing and saying, does it exist? Right? Does Hashem exist or not?
Yeah, I think back then when you and I were in yeshiva, I think those questions did not fly. I think now, though, there are more sort of initiatives to teach emunah in the classroom, and I know that they use some things by Rabbi Hanan Wasserman as as material for this. Well, the few things he says, I'm pretty sure he goes through the watchmaker argument, which is a philosophical argument, whether it's sound or not. That is a philosophical argument. It does deserve to be discussed, I think.
Have you ever actually read what he wrote about it?
So this is the other thing, is that the part that bothers me, and this has nothing to do with proving Hashem's existence or Matan Torah or anything. He just says that the great people in history who denied either God's existence, I'm not sure if he says denied God's existence or Yiddishkeit or both, only did so because they were, he says, like Mekolkol B'Taiva or something. They were, their minds, their rational faculties were moved by their physical passions and things like that, and so they couldn't get to the truth, which was the Torah and the giving of the Torah. Well, the concern I have with that is not even whether what he's trying to prove is correct or not. That's not my concern so much, but there are definitely religions and cults and all sorts of things that are more demanding than Judaism, or from Judaism as we know it. I mean, we know there are priests who live celibate lifestyles, and that's Christianity. I mean, there are definitely have been more rigorous and more demanding religious codes than Judaism. So I don't know what he's saying then. What about those people who took on those crazy ascetic celibate lifestyles? Are they also disturbed by their taiva? It sounds like they have no taiva, or they're utterly denying all their taiva. So how come they didn't arrive at Judaism? That's why I just don't think it's a sound argument to make.
Right. I imagine that he would say something like they were doing it for the fame or for the respect or something like that. But it's my objection is more along the lines of what you're saying. But he says that either someone who doesn't accept the cosmological argument, he doesn't use that term, is either an idiot or is misled by his taivas, and those are the only two options. And neither of those are very complimentary. It's just the way he frames it is what I have the biggest problem with. The argument itself is, I don't think it works as well as he thinks, but whatever, I can disagree with people, that's fine. It's just the insulting way that he frames it.
He's saying if you don't agree with me, you're obviously, I'm right, because if you don't agree with me, you're obviously wrong, and you're an idiot.
Right, you're either an idiot or you're a novel.
Right. And I think I would venture to say, I don't think that's something the Chovos HaLevavos would say, or the Rambam, or anyone. I think the Rambam did have his fair share of name calling to people who didn't believe, but I think at the end of the day it came down to argument. I don't think the Chovos HaLevavos would ever just start calling people names as an argument. Maybe he would, some Rishonim have also called people names like that, but you wouldn't use that as your argument. You would then present an argument like we have in Parakdalad here about logic and things like that, and a rational approach to it. I don't think they would be satisfied with that, and I don't think that would be Yotze, what Rabbeinu Bachya considers the sort of the chiyuv to push yourself to understand Hashem. Anyone could just say, if you don't agree with all my Hashkafas, you're an idiot, but that's not really using logic, and I don't think Rabbeinu Bachya would have been satisfied with that.
I think you're right about that. I'm a little concerned. What kind of effect does it have on a 14-year-old to be told that if you have any doubts, you're either an idiot or you're being overwhelmed by your desires?
Yeah, that's a good, I don't know. People say things about how these little lessons, what is this teaching our kids when this happens in the news or when this happens in the media, what is this teaching our kids? And my response always is, well, probably nothing, and they'll grow up and change their mind anyway. So I don't know about using this as a material in the classroom having an effect on kids, but definitely the way it's conveyed, the way the whole topic is conveyed, I doubt it leads to what Rabbeinu Bachya would want as someone who's really sort of analyzing things with logic. I think it becomes very dogmatic, even though they want it to appear philosophical or like real rationalizations and justifications for the beliefs. I think it all ultimately just boils down to more dogma, and I think that has a bad effect on kids. I think kids are probably either turned off by that or just don't get the philosophy, and ultimately nothing is accomplished. The end of chapter 4 here, I'm actually sort of happy about how he discusses the Shema here, because what he wants from it is that the complete recognition of the unity of God, that Hashem is one. And I think I guess this is still a question on my mind. I'm still not entirely sure whether Shema, say Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, whether Shema is supposed to be an expression of monotheism, that Hashem is the only God, or that Hashem himself is one. Because you could say that Hashem is one being, but that doesn't really preclude the idea that there are other beings, right? So this always bothered me, I think, since I was younger. How do we see in Shema the idea that Hashem is the only God? And I think there are different ways to interpret the word Echad in that. But here, certainly Rabbeinu Bachya's interpretation is limited to the unity of God, right? And that's sort of in step with the literal understanding, right? Hashem is one, so we're going to talk now about Hashem's oneness, his unity. He's not really... It's obviously indirectly related, but it's not necessarily correlated with there not being other gods. And obviously, the Chovos HaLevavos is a monotheist and believes that Hashem is the only one. But this pasuk is only serving right now as a proof of Hashem's oneness, not discussions of other gods and their lack of.
Right. Well, it doesn't say that Hashem is the only God. The first part of the pasuk certainly is just it's informative. Hear, Israel, He is your God, and which God? Yahweh. That's the God, as opposed to Baal and El and Marduk and all the other ones. My theory about the last part, Echad, is that a lot of the gods of the ancient Near East, and I think the interpretation of the Indian pantheon today, is that they are aspects of one being. Originally, all these different gods were their own beings, and then the theology developed, and you had like El was the god, and he had all these different aspects the aspect of Baal and the aspect of Asherah and so on and so forth. And I think that this is my theory anyway, is that this is saying that your God is not this sort of God that is made up of all these other gods. He is one. He's a singular being.
Well, so you're sort of saying that, in fact, the Shema is sort of affirmation of polytheism, and we're saying that your God is one as opposed to other gods. I mean, interesting that you could read the pasuk that way, but I mean,
I don't know so much an affirmation as a recognition, because the people who originally read these words or listened to these words more likely lived in a polytheistic culture, and I think this is how they would have heard it. And most of them were not monotheists. There's these little figurines discovered all over Israel that were household gods, and you had the hilltop temples. And they weren't strict monotheists. They believed that Hashem was their God. Hashem is our God. And there's all these other gods that we can also worship or that belong to other people, and so we shouldn't worship because they're their gods and not our gods. But yes, it's definitely not the traditional understanding of the pasuk.
Yeah, and it's not entirely clear also when you talk about the household gods and like sort of the folk religion that sort of was around. I mean, even by Tanakh's account, right, there was a lot of avodah zarah going on. It may not have been considered legitimate by the powers that be, right? The leaders of the community may not have been okay with it.
Well,
I don't know. I don't know if historians know one way or the other about that, but I would just say that even if the Judaism of the time did allow for these sort of other deities, were these other deities supposed to be independent of Hashem as totally, completely other gods, or were they more like sort of like malachim or things like that? In which case, and I don't mean actual malach, I just mean were they supposed to be sort of these secondary gods that we also had, and you don't even have to use the word God necessarily to describe them. You could call them other things if you wanted. They were shadim, they were malachim, I don't know. In which case it wouldn't be too distant from the Judaism, the Yiddishkeit that we know today, where there are malachim and there are controversies about whether you're allowed to daven to malachim, whether you can daven to tzaddikim, right? So
I do think that malachim was a clever workaround for keeping the lower gods, because most of these pantheons work this way. There's one great god who is the father of the other gods, or who created the universe, or something like that. And then you have all the lower gods, who may be, important deities in their own right, but aren't the great god. And I think you could think of it that way, that they may have conceptualized that Hashem is the great god, and then you had all the lower gods. And at some point, the lower gods just became malachim.
I definitely hear that theory, but again, it's like it's just not entirely clear. There's this blurred line between real, like, strong monotheism and then polytheism, and there's all this gray area, which made obviously, like, even as late as a couple hundred years ago, when I think of Sam Sofer was disturbed by the piyut Machnise Rachamim, right? You're sort of asking the malachim to do things for you that made a lot of even recent rabbanim very uncomfortable. And so, like, this issue of the gray area between monotheism and polytheism has sort of spilled out into modern times, and I think it's probably still ongoing. I think you might find in, I don't know, Hasidic literature some things that would make a Litvak uncomfortable, or vice versa, or something, where you find these, like, questionable things in sefarim that make you a little nervous.
The whole idea of the sphira very much sort of, they stress that it's all metaphor, but if it's not a metaphor, it is great polytheism.
Yeah, when I was told when I was in, I think even when I was in elementary school, I think one of my rebbeim said that there's this malach in the Midrashim, in the Kabbalah Sfarim called Metatron, and some of the Hasidim are mocked not to say that whole name. I mean, that sounds like another deity to me. If you're not even saying his name, doesn't that sound like something's going on? I think that any stark, strong version of monotheism would reject that.
Yeah, definitely.
So, yeah. But and yet somehow, as we perceive ourselves, and obviously every from person today perceives him or herself as a monotheist, and certainly says Shema with that intention that Hashem is the only power in existence, and even if this is not the purest form of monotheism possible, it still does in some way differentiate itself from polytheism, in that Hashem is supposed to be behind everything, even if we have these other powers sort of out there.
Right, and this was one of the things I remember asking about when I was in high school, about the malachim who control everything, and how far down does that go? Right, so there's a malach that controls the sun, and there's a malach that controls the grass. Is there a malach for every blade of grass? Some people say yes, some people say no. Now, what about each individual cell? What about the molecules and the atoms and the quarks? Right, how far down does this malach thing go? And it starts breaking down at that point.
Right, I could hear the confusion there. Yeah, how many malachim are there, and how much control do they really have?
Right, but now I think more is that idea of everything having a malach goes back to elemental religion, where everything is alive and everything has a spirit or a deity connected to it that you can pray to, that you can ask for things that controls it.
Right, and we don't know when that idea came up, when that idea became part of Judaism, or if it always was.
I would guess that it always was. That Judaism didn't just appear one day. It evolved, like everything does.
Well, you have ideas that are there from the beginning, and you have ideas that are fairly new, or ways of putting forth ideas like the Chovos HaLevavos, where the format is new in the sense that this is not the way Tanakh is written, right? He's certainly using he's using the format of the books that were written at the time, philosophical works, etc.
Right, which is true of every single period in Jewish history.
Exactly, yeah.
Tanakh.
Yeah.
Tanakh is written as contemporary documents were written, and then you got the Mishnah, which sort of just is Torah Shabbat Peh on its own, don't authority, this is what we do. And then you have the Gemara, which says, okay, this is what we do. Where do we learn this from in Tanakh? And you get the Tosis, which is basically scholasticism, and so on and so forth.
Right. I don't know how many, documents we have from those earlier periods, but certainly things change as time continues. Just even the fact that it changes, that the style of writing changes from one generation to the next shows you that there's something else going on, that there's not one uniform way of writing as a Rav, Rabbi, Posek, etc. Styles do change. Having said that, I think that there is a distinct style nowadays that you see in Yeshiva sefarim, in Chovos HaLevavos. I think they did develop their own distinct style, there's distinct structure and language, etc. But it would be a mistake to say that there was always the same sort of course of writing, or else how come Rabbanim nowadays don't write like Hanam and Amoram? Clearly there have been changes in the style.
I'm not enough of Balamzim to know enough about current Svarim to comment, but popular books written from audience are very much in the style of current literature. Have you ever read Strictly Kosher Reading?
Nope.
So he writes about this, about how say self-help books are basically self-help with sort of like what the Chovos HaLevavos is. It's exactly a self-help book, but with citations to Tanakh sprinkled in, or the Gemara, to make it Jewish.
I see. Okay.
Or parenting books it's current child psychology with torture and makoros sprinkled in, so we can say this is our Masari, even when it's totally not.
I think that it's sort of funny we sort of diverged into this topic, but it's sort of related to the Chovos HaLevavos, because I think the modern version of borrowing philosophy from other cultures, or at least joining the conversations of other cultures, is, what, as you described, like the self-help book and the psychology books that are coming out for the past 40, 50 years from writers. When I was in the Sith, I remember reading something by a frum psychologist, but it was also sort of a lot of Pirkei Avos in there. I think it was supposed to be sort of a psychological approach to Pirkei Avos, and what it did was it used some of the pop psychology terms and ideas like self-esteem, right? And sort of adapted it to sort of purport a frum message. And it's in a way not too different than what philosophers were doing at the times of the Rishonim, although obviously they were, I think, probably had a better command of the material, or at least had a more ambitious plan to adapt it into a real Jewish context.
Okay, I think we'll wrap it up here.
Okay.
Thank you so much for joining
All right,
me.
thank you for having me on.
That was my conversation with Zachremia. I hope you found our discussion entertaining and edifying.
This has been Hashkafa with a Heretic. Until next week, keep questioning, and remember that kashas aren't teruts and insults aren't answers, and while there are many good reasons to be frum, the obvious truth of orthodoxy isn't one of them.